Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm finally here with another video, so I apologize for the long hiatus, but I just wasn't really sure what to cover after all of my other tutorial videos. So I gave it some thought, and I think I want to do an introduction to flash photography. Right now is a really good time to get into flash photography. Because now the market's really expanded. There's a lot of competition and a lot of good viable options for third-party flash units. But don't get me wrong, it's a lot cheaper now than it used to be. Like when I started shooting with flash, maybe I want to say 9 years ago, the only good options that were fully featured were first-party flashes, and those could be well over $400 a pop. So nowadays it's cheaper, but it's not exactly like a budget-conscious route to go with your lighting. But if it is something that you're interested in, I think there's a lot of advantages to flash photography that you don't really get if you're just shooting with continuous lights or like LED light banks or natural light. And before I get started, I just want to mention that when I say flash, I don't really mean like these little pop-up dealies that come on your camera. I'm talking more about speed lights, which is these standalone flash units that will plug into the hot shoe on your camera. So why would you want to go this route? Why would you want to shoot with flash? It does add some complication to your kit, and it's definitely a monetary investment. But the main thing with shooting flash is versatility, and I think that's something that first attracted me to the idea of shooting with flash. So this flash, not only does it have a lot of power for a single light source, you also have really fine-grained control over it. So with this one, I can shoot from full power down to 1/128th power. So if you do the math, that should be about 7 stops. That's a pretty good range to have in a light source. When you combine the fine-grained control of the power with its portability, the ability to trigger it off camera, and the compatibility with a wide array of light modifiers, you get a lot of utility out of this thing, and that's why I like to shoot with flash, at least when I'm in a home studio. Now I want to go over a few basic concepts before you start shooting flash. The first one would be how to actually connect this to your camera. Now, every single flash is going to come with a hot shoe mount. That doesn't mean that you should be shooting with it necessarily attached to your camera hot shoe. In fact, most of the time, I'm shooting with this off camera. And I'm sure we've all seen a bad flash photo, and that's because when your light is very intense and very small and on axis, it's just going to cover everything in a harsh flat light, and that's not what you want. So the way to avoid that is to move it off camera and shoot with the light at an angle so you get some detail and shadow and relief on your subject. So the way that I do this is to pair this with a radio trigger. These are really handy to have because you can shoot with it with the light at a range wirelessly, and you don't need direct line of sight to the flash in order to get it to trigger. If you're shooting on a tabletop environment, you don't necessarily need this amount of versatility. They do make TTL cables, which are basically just cables that connect on one end to the shoe mount of the flash, and then the other end to your camera hot shoe, and then you can trigger it as if it were attached to your camera. The second concept I want to go over is probably easier if I just demonstrate it, but it's the idea that you can adjust your flash independent of any continuous light sources you have. So the way a flash works is that it's going to dump all of its light all at the same time in a thousandth of a second or less. So that means when your camera shutter opens, you're going to get a burst of light from your flash, and then that's it. Versus a continuous light, when your camera shutter opens, your sensor is going to collect the light gradually as time goes on. So what this means is that when you're shooting with flash, the amount of exposure that you get out of your flash isn't going to be dependent on your shutter speed. As soon as the shutter opens, you're going to get all of the light that you have from the flash. And then it's going to start collecting ambient light. So what this means is that when you're shooting, you can use your shutter speed to dial in the amount of ambient exposure, and then your aperture, your ISO, or the flash unit itself can control how much flash power you get out of it. And the last really basic thing that you're going to want to do when you get a flash is to make a light modifier, because you rarely want to be shooting with a bare flash head. So the simplest, most clutch, most useful modifier that I have is this Softbox, which is something that I made myself out of scraps basically. This is just a shipping box with some duct tape. I lined the inside with white paper, and then this outside I just cut from a white t-shirt. So this is all stuff that I had lying around, and if you don't have these materials, you can obviously go get them for a few dollars. I would recommend this over a light box, which I see a lot of product photographers shooting with, just because a light box is pretty restrictive. So it's going to get in the way of using like sets, dioramas, and props, because you only get like a confined space to work in. And B, it's going to get in the way of your positioning of your lights. So a softbox gives you a lot more versatility. It's not really going to get in the way of you using sets, and it's obviously not going to get in the way of positioning your lighting. So with that out of the way, let's move over to my tabletop, and I can show you a few single flash setups that I use from time to time when I'm shooting figures. All right, so I put together a quick tabletop setup just to show some of the ideas I want to talk about when we cover flash photography. So I have a figure here, and then I have my flash set up in a softbox, and it's kind of in front of the figure and at a bit of an angle, as you can see here. I'm just going to shoot with the camera directly in front. And then I also have a continuous light source in the form of my LED light bank. So this way I can show you what happens when you shoot with flash, how to manipulate the ambient light as well. Okay, the first shot I'm going to take is going to be at 1/250th of a second at f8 and ISO 160. So what this is going to do is completely take out the ambient light. So what you're going to see is the effect of only having the flash as your light source. But as I slow down the shutter, you're going to see more and more of that ambient light coming in. So now I have the shutter at 1/8 of a second. And you can see the preview on the back of my camera brightening up too. So now I have the shutter at 1.5 seconds. So this is basically going to be a long exposure. As you can see from the sequence of shots, I can add in more and more ambient light by slowing down my shutter speed, and that's not going to affect the amount of light that I get out of the flash. Now, for the setup itself, this is one that I use pretty commonly. It's going to approximate, if you use it as a single light, it's going to approximate Rembrandt lighting in portraiture, which is not always actually going to be the best choice when you're shooting figures, but it is like a really easy, quick setup that's going to look pretty good most of the time. My second setup, I've moved the figure forward a little bit so that I can position the softbox behind it. And it's not really pointing directly at the figure, it's pointing more forward towards the camera. So when you combine this setup, this flash setup, with ambient lighting, you're going to get a rim light. And this is a technique that I use a lot for my indoor shots. Actually, what I like to do is to have a second light source to the other side of the figure as well, so that I can get highlights on both sides. But when you're shooting with just a single ambient light, sometimes you want like a little bit of rim lighting so that you can really make the figure pop a little more against the background, or you can highlight some of the details of the sculpt a little better. And this will be the last of the basic single light setups I'm going to go over today. So if you do want that sort of light box blown out sort of look, you can put the flash directly behind the figure. And what you're going to get is a uniform white background, and then you can add in the ambient light to act as a fill. But another thing you can do is to just raise up your shutter speed to block out the ambient, and then what you'll have is just a cool silhouette effect. So I'm not going to go over every single light setup that I use. I'll save those for future videos. But these are just a few simple ones that you can do with one flash and a softbox. So hopefully this video has demystified flash photography at least a little bit for you, and maybe given you some things to think about. I know that it can be a high barrier to entry, and then there's a learning curve on top of that. But for me at least, like, the amount of control and versatility that I get out of shooting with flash has really been worth the money and time investment. So that'll do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up. If you're a new viewer, hit that subscribe button. And if you want to give me a little tip for what I do have a Ko-fi account, which will be linked below. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.